Want to know how to live skeptically and still have friends? So do I. Let's figure it out. Actually Speaking, a podcast that explores the human side of skepticism, critical thinking, and the skills we need to make it through the day. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Actually Speaking, a podcast that sets the science aside and explores the human side of skepticism. My name is Meraz, and today we'll be discussing realistic expectations. I'm guessing that everyone listening at some point has found themselves in extremely frustrating situations when discussing skeptical topics with non-skeptical friends. I think it's a pretty safe guess. For me, those frustrating moments actually span an entire spectrum of situations. Fights with family over politics or religion, Facebook arguments trying to explain the importance of vaccinations, for example, lost tempers explaining why the world isn't going to end in 2012, arguments over alternative medicines, one of my favorites, or simply avoidance by friends who feel they've been insulted one too many times. Does it sound familiar? It probably does, and I'm sure many of you could expand upon the list significantly. What's common about all these situations is the negative impact they potentially have on everyone involved. I mean, let's face it, if the end result was, why yes, you're right, how could I have been so wrong, we'd all be pretty happy. In reality, these interactions rarely reach positive conclusions, and usually leave everyone feeling angry, insulted, defensive, and ultimately drained and discouraged. And that's not good for anyone, and it certainly doesn't promote critical thinking. But does it have to be this way? I don't think we enter into these situations expecting a negative outcome. We usually mean well and have the best of intentions. We want to help. We want to share valuable information and protect people from harmful beliefs, practices, and products. And most of the time, we're just as hurt by the negative backlash we get when those good intentions are buried under an argument that's spiraling out of control. This certainly isn't what most of us want, especially not when we're sharing information that we value. But there is something misaligned here. There are pieces that aren't fitting together properly. We're entering into interactions with others expecting a certain outcome, but often getting something quite different. So what is it that's going wrong? Well, in dealing with frustration in relationships, we often look at two things: expectations and communication. In fact, there's a handy little saying that you may have heard before: expectation without communication leads to frustration. It's pretty handy in marital relationships, since very often we fail to communicate our expectations to a spouse. The solution is usually to talk. Sit down, communicate what we're thinking, feeling, and expecting. It actually works. However, in our situation, there is plenty of communication happening. There's certainly no shortage of talking. So by simple process of elimination, if the problem isn't with a lack of communication, then the problem must lie with expectations. In fact, for the purpose of our situation, that saying might actually read, communication without an appropriate expectation leads to frustration. I think that the source of much of the frustration we feel as we live skeptical lifestyles lies in our expectations. What we're seeking to accomplish isn't always realistic. And if we're striving for an unrealistic outcome, we usually fail each and every time. Sometimes we need to focus on what we can accomplish and not what we want to accomplish. What we want is usually out of our control, but not out of reach. So how do we go about changing our perspective and seeing the situation a little differently? Well, we use our critical thinking skills and we analyze the situation. Now, I'm using the term expectation, but what we're really talking about are simply goals and the manner in which we reach them. Goals are important because they help us stay focused so that our efforts remain constructive. When we don't have realistic goals or simply lose sight of them, our interactions usually devolve into negative territory whether we're conscious of it or not. So let's be aware of what we're working towards. Now, if you're trying to identify an unrealistic goal, a good place to start is to look for what needs to be said or done to achieve it. And let's leave out the agreeing to disagree option, since that really isn't reflective of any form of accomplishment. Here are some examples to get us focused. Arguing whether God exists. Arguing whether homeopathy is a viable medical treatment. Arguing whether vaccinations are good science or a government conspiracy. Arguing whether the world will end in 2012. You get the idea. So think for a moment and ask yourself, what would need to occur in order for you to feel as though you've succeeded in an argument over any of those topics? That your work was done, that your mission was accomplished? For most of us, the argument would need to end with the other person admitting that they're wrong and that you're right. Agreement, or conversion on the spot, is what we're often after. That's certainly been the case in my experience, and honestly, how many times has that ever happened? An insignificant number of times, if at all, I'm sure. The truth is, we can't change people's minds or decide things for them. No matter how loud, long, or forcefully we argue, We can't make people think, feel, believe, or trust anything that they don't choose for themselves. It's an unrealistic expectation to believe we can. People have to be free to make their own decisions in order for those choices to have any significance in their lives. No one else can do it for them. And realizing this is a very important reality to accept and a vital step towards more constructive relationships. But once we do, our efforts can actually become much easier and far more productive. Well, this was the realization I came to. Expecting to win an argument and force a conclusion on someone else is unrealistic and ultimately counterproductive. Instead, I need to focus on conditions for growth, critical thought, reasoned decision-making when I interact with non-skeptics. We'll actually touch on these conditions in more detail in a future episode. However, another very practical reason for setting realistic goals is a simple matter of who's in control. In order for goals to be attainable, they also need to be based on things that we actually have control over. When we enter into an argument with someone who doesn't agree with our line of thinking, they're almost always trying to win the argument as well. This is a frustrating situation and makes me, and probably you, want to argue even more. But think about this for a moment. If your goal is to win by changing their mind, then your success is completely in the hands of your opponent. You've given them control and power over your sense of accomplishment. From their perspective, as long as they don't agree with you, you lose. And in the end, we often end up feeling defeated, frustrated, and probably angry as to why others don't see things the way that we do. This situation plays itself out over and over again because we keep the same expectation to change the other person's mind. Our goals and the ability to achieve them need to remain completely within our control. This is what makes them realistic. Okay, those are examples of how unrealistic expectations can fail and end up being counterproductive. It might not seem like it, but there are other options. There are ways in which we can share valuable information, promote critical thinking, and actually walk away with a feeling of accomplishment. Now, this is where I'll switch gears a bit and simply share with you the process that I went through and the conclusions I arrived at. Your own process will be different, but I'm confident you can adapt it to your own specific needs. Remember, my overall goals are to 1, live skeptically while having positive, constructive relationships, and 2, promote critical thinking instead of shutting it down. All the examples I've shared so far are fairly typical for me over the course of any particular day or week. And in the past, my attempts to convince friends and family of how wrong they are and how right I am has only damaged our relationships and done little to promote critical thinking. So, in coming up with more realistic expectations, I defaulted to the least common denominator within my social circles. I hypothetically picked a person who's as non-skeptical as they come, while also being someone I care about a great deal. If I could find a way to successfully interact with a non-skeptic like that, I could adapt that approach to others. I'd encourage you to do the same. And remember, for me, this represents a starting point, a neutral territory in my interactions with family and friends. Let me focus on each of my expectations and how I changed them. When looking at family and friends, I realized that most were individuals that would never be science enthusiasts. They weren't people who would ever be networked or involved with a scientific community or resources. For me, to expect them to have the same level of enthusiasm for scientific information, discoveries, or methodology was simply unrealistic. Yet, this is often what I was striving for, and it was causing a lot of frustration. Rather than expecting to promote a love of science among my family and friends, I decided that a more realistic expectation would be to pull back and promote a sense of curiosity in the natural world, which they could then interpret and apply in whatever way they wanted. While my own curiosities lie in scientific fields, others might take them in completely different directions. Curiosity is at the heart of skepticism, critical thinking, inquiry, and science. It's the fuel that drives the process, and that makes it a perfect place to begin. Another expectation I had of my friends and family is that they would actively seek out, identify, and avoid all the scams and pseudoscience and mysticism that's out there vying for their attention. Now, this has traditionally been one area where I've had the least patience and expected immediate agreement and acceptance. Of course, it never worked. In fact, I have some friends that simply delved even deeper into pseudoscience for the pure joy of watching me go nuts. What I wasn't realizing was that my valuable information was often heard as, "You're wrong, and here's why," or "You're an idiot." No one likes to be corrected, insulted, intentionally or not, and made to look and feel foolish for something they believe. Thinking back to my own experiences, I still feel the sting of embarrassment I had when I realized how crazy some of my things I once believed in were. While trying to be helpful, I was making friends feel stupid, and I was often embarrassing them in public settings. Rather than expecting to make full-fledged consumer watchdogs or pseudoscience debunkers out of all my friends and family, I decided that a more realistic expectation would be to simply promote a sense of caution in the vast amount of information they're being bombarded with every day. Whether they decide to act upon that caution is up to them. So, curiosity and caution. That's what I came up with for myself. These are very basic and simple goals, but they're appropriate for the point on the skeptical spectrum where most of my family and friends lie. In order to live skeptically and still maintain positive relationships, these are going to be my starting points and the goals for my interactions. It's my hope that they'll help me to be less threatening, more approachable, non-judgmental, less forceful, and ultimately open the lines of communication so information can flow. With these expectations in place, it actually gives a new dynamic to my interactions with others. What I expect from my interactions is no longer to change their mind, it's to help them make informed decisions. This is good, because it gives my skeptical lifestyle a constructive purpose. I won't go through my day trying to change people's minds. I can't do that anyway. Instead, I'll go through my day sharing information in a way that assists people in making informed decisions, promotes a curiosity in the natural world, and instills a sense of caution in uncertain claims. Either by example or in conversations, I'll be promoting a positive, approachable, and practical image of skepticism and critical thinking. Now, is this all I can expect from my interactions with others? No, certainly not. It's simply a starting point, an approach that has the greatest compatibility with those non-skeptics in my life. It serves to open doors, free the flow of information, and help others view you as a viable resource when their curiosity produces questions or their caution wants to learn more. It is only the beginning of a skeptical lifestyle. But you must prepare yourself for the possibility that some people may never want to leave this starting point. That's their choice. Think back to people who have inspired you. I'm guessing that they were rarely people who simply told you what to do, insulted your current beliefs, or angered you for not agreeing with them sooner. They were probably people who planted seeds that may have taken years to germinate. They often filled you with wonder for the natural world, guided you in new directions when you were ready, and supported you when things got rough, and never, ever made you feel stupid. These were the people that made a difference in my life, and everyone needs a chance to grow and discover their own path in a similar way. My role model was Carl Sagan. I can actually credit him solely for my skeptical nature today. Yet, my memory of him was never associated with skepticism at all. He just made me curious about so many things and challenged me to proceed in the world cautiously. I figured out all the rest. And my path is different from others. But even with different paths and conclusions, when we do things right, we all end up in the same ballpark. So, let's recap. My first steps in living skeptically while promoting critical thinking among people in my daily life is to proceed with more realistic goals. So, gone are my desire to create science enthusiasts among my friends, or to push my conclusions and bypass critical thinking altogether. Instead, my interactions with people will 1. Promote a sense of curiosity in the natural world. 2. Instill a sense of caution in questionable claims. 3. Assist people in making informed decisions. Personally, I think that's definitely achievable and a lot less stressful than what I was doing before. Early on, I began exploring ways of being less confrontational with people and trying to strengthen some of my relationships that had been strained by my skepticism. One specific example was a conversation I had with my mother regarding H1N1 and vaccinations. We were on the phone, and I made a conscious effort to not lecture her, but to simply share what I knew in a way that allowed her to choose whether or not she agreed. The conversation was pretty light on science and focused more on how confusing all the facts the media was presenting were to filter through. What would have been an abruptly ended conversation or even an argument turned out to be a nice talk, which conveyed far more information than I'd normally be able to share. For her, how I presented the information made all the difference, and it sparked a curiosity in her about the subject that I had rarely seen before. It was nice to have both an informative and pleasant conversation for a change. When we were done, she asked me how I knew about all this stuff and how I could be so confident that it was correct. I explained that while I did learn a lot of it from just general resources on the internet, much of my information came from doctors and scientists that I knew personally and whose work and opinions I trusted. I explained briefly who some of these people were and how I knew them, and at the end she said to me, "You're lucky. You know all these scientists that can help you know what's true and what's not. I would never be able to figure any of this out, and I'll never know any people like that." I responded by saying, "Well, you know me." Our conversation didn't go any further, but I found myself thinking about it quite a bit after we hung up. It left me wondering just how many other people feel the same way that she does, that they're destined to not know what is true or not because they don't have the luxury of personal connections with scientists or doctors that they can trust. Do people need to have those connections in order to make sense of scientific research? No, they don't need to know the scientists. They don't need to know researchers. They don't need to know teachers. What they need are practical and approachable resources within their daily lives that they can trust. For my mom, that resource is me. And the reality is that it's always been and always will be me. That's my responsibility. And I think it's the responsibility of all skeptics to be that trusted resource for family and friends. Because the reality is, you may be the only reliable resource that person ever has. You may be the only link to the larger scientific community that they'll ever know. That makes our personal relationships incredibly valuable and crucial to the promotion not just of critical thinking or skepticism, but to the dissemination of factual information. Confronting misinformation, harmful practices, beliefs, and products is a necessity of our community. But shutting people out or down in our daily lives simply because they don't see the world as we do is often counterproductive. The civility we extend, the relationships we cultivate, and the manner by which we communicate all matter. Our greatest tool is our ability to communicate, and our greatest resource is each other. If you have questions, comments, or would like to share your own tips and ideas on living skeptically, send them to actuallyspeaking@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/factually. Thanks for listening.